Yeah, sure. This direction.
And I'm not Crescenzi.
Yes, marvelous.
Okay, fab.
My wife is half Italian. So
Great. Okay, thanks for coming. Go after these things. Thank you.
try to make sure I get things right. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this third and final Conservative Home Spring Conference Fringe event. I'm Mark Wallace. I'm the Chief Executive of Conservative Home. We're really glad to be joining you and our august panel today to discuss this vital topic of levelling up UK regions through global trade. I'd like to start by thanking the London School of Economics and Political Science for partnering with us on this discussion. We've done some work with them before, and it's always great to get the chance, I think, to talk about matters of high policy and their practical effects on real life. And I think when you see the conference and indeed the Conservative Party talking about things like getting on with the job, it's very easy, I think, sometimes to look at the big high banner, to read the manifesto at election time, and then sometimes, dare I say, some of my colleagues, even in the press, forget that what we're really talking about is things that matter in actual life. Particularly, I know many of you as Conservative Home readers here in the audience or watching us online will be looking ahead to, for example, the local elections or to the next general election, who knows when it may come. And for a lot of Conservatives, there's that excitement, I think, that comes with thinking back to what happened to the 2019 election, the potential of politics to encourage people to take chances and make real changes in how they might want their countries and their communities to be run in future. But there's also, of course, I think for Tories, after these turbulent years, a bit of trepidation to wonder actually what will be changing people's minds electorally. And I think the one thing I keep coming back to, and you'll have seen this in much of our work on Conservative Home, is the kind of Ben Houchen experience, that model in the Tees Valley of kind of Tory insurgency, where, notably, I don't think a single vote has been won in the Tees Valley by a press release. I don't think a single vote has been won by a promise of a review or an inquiry or a new policy stratagem. Every single vote has been won or indeed lost there by changing people's lives, by that actual message of when you step out of your house in the morning, does your street look different? Does your community look different? Is the local economy different? Are your own prospects and those of your family and your neighbours different? And a huge amount of that, of course, comes down to the place of the UK economy, the state of the UK economy and its place in the world. And I think that's one of the things we're very fortunate to get the chance to explore today, is actually how can you make those localised or regional economic differences levelling up with the new trade policy that we have for the first time in over 4 decades, that the UK has its own trade policy. We've seen those various trade agreements being negotiated and signed, and of course that is going. It is all done with a view to real material difference in the British economy. Now, we're very fortunate to be joined today by Professor Riccardo Crescenzi, the Professor of Economic Geography at the LSE, by Dr. Liam Fox, who's former Secretary of State for International Trade, former candidate for Secretary General of the WTO, somebody who'll be familiar to all of you and is very experienced in this field, and also by Debbie Francis Obe, the Chair of the Lancashire Enterprise Partnership, which of course here being in Blackpool to give us, frankly, I think it'd be actively wrong for us to talk about levelling up UK regions through global trade without actually talking about the local economy in the region where we're holding this conference. So without further ado from me, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Professor Crescenzi to give his remarks to begin.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today. I will start by asking a question. It is the point in time which usually my students turn their cameras off. Why do we have areas in decline? So what is it that shapes decline? What is it that shapes the lack of economic success? And if we go through the white paper on levelling up, what we do see is something about skills, something about infrastructure, something about technology. But a lot of the stories that we read, and there is also evidence being collected, tell a story of something that comes from within, that comes from the local areas, being unable or not having enough of some sort of inputs. What I think is somewhat less discussed and less emphasized, also in terms of public policies, is the role of connectivity. How and to what extent the ability of these places to connect with the rest of the country and with the wider world shapes their economic opportunities. And what is it that shapes, that develops this connectivity? And this connectivity comes mostly through trade and investments. So that's the fundamental role of private investments that shape and have a very important role, and we have consistent evidence throughout the world, looking at the US, but also looking at emerging economies, of how important this connectivity is. And connectivity takes the form of inward and outward investments, as well as trade. But when we reflect on the economic consequences of this connectivity, we really have to change the traditional way of considering trade as a sort of one-off relationship. Because more and more, trade and FDI are interlinked in complex value chains. So that's how goods are produced. The production of goods doesn't happen anymore within one single establishment, within one single local economy. More and more different components are produced by different firms, located in different regions, sometimes in different countries. So understanding how places can benefit from trade and from in foreign direct investments, from connectivity, very much depends on us understanding who is doing what type of firms and where are contributing to the final product that then goes on the market. And very often what we fail to understand is that when we think about, okay, what type of investments do we want to attract in order to boost economic development in less developed regions, is not only the investment as such, it's not only that individual, say foreign firms or firms that comes from the outside that matters, but is the potential that this investment has to activate local suppliers, that has to activate other firms that sometimes are the ones that are from the local economy, because they are the smaller suppliers, are the smaller firms. So it's really important to reflect in particular about foreign direct investment, not only in terms of a financial flow, not only in terms of the sheer size of the investment, but in terms of its developmental potential and the extent to which this investment can link up the region, can link up the local economy to wider, what we call global value chains, to the global distribution of value across the globe. So to conclude, it's very important when we look at our local economies as part of wider global value chains, then the entire policy mix, in a certain sense, changes. Because when we reflect about this, we realize how important trade deals are for local economies, so how important it is for local economies to have their say in reshaping global connectivity, in reshaping investments and agreements about investments and trade. But we also realize how important it is to think about our infrastructural policies, not only as something that needs to serve the local economy, but something that needs to support this connectivity. So thinking about ports, for example, is not only about an internal exercise, about thinking about, okay, what is it that local firms need, but it's how and to what extent, for example, ports can be nodes in a global system of exchange, and how and to what extent they can facilitate the development of this type of connection, bringing value to the local economy. So that's about coordinating policies that have to do with the three key pillars that we mentioned before: technology, skills, and infrastructure. But when we reassess these pillars in a wider global framework, the way in which we prioritize investments and also the way in which we present these investments to the outside world changes. And I think this is of paramount importance. So that's about thinking about trade and investments as a tool for leveling up that has been somewhat outside the key conversation. And for this, we need a national strategy. We need a national value proposition. So what is the key value for foreign investors to invest in the UK? But also, we need this value proposition that has changed after Brexit. We need to see how this value proposition changes when this is declined, when it is considered in the light of the differences across different areas within the UK. So what is the value added? What is the unique selling point of each individual area? And how areas can work together in order to make this value proposition more apparent and more consistent to external investors. So we also need to make sure that there is no competition between different areas, because otherwise the effect is a race to the bottom to the advantage of big multinationals. Think about the headquarter 2 case, Amazon in the US, where municipalities have been bidding to attract Amazon at quarter 2, a competition where the only winner getting most of the benefits, of course, is the multinational. So the story is we need to attract investors, deal with investors, make foreign investments a central pillar of our local development strategy. But at the same time, we need to be cautious. We need to make sure that we have a proactive environment and we have deals and we deal with investors in a way that works for the local economy to make sure that it's not only the big corporation that extract the benefit, but these benefits are shared with local people through supply chain and local contents. A final key step in this is having agencies at the local level, like investment promotion agencies, national and regional, so at the local level, that are able to deal with investors, that are able to communicate the value proposition of local economies, but also to coordinate local policies in such a way that they can work for investors and to the benefit of the local economy.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that, Professor, which I think really helps to set the scene for our next speaker. As I say, Dr. Liam Fox has done, in his extensive Westminster career, has done great work on a range of different fronts, but obviously has taken a really specific and particular interest in the UK's trade policy, not least by being the man charged after the EU referendum with helping to create a British independent trade policy and to set the terms on which that international trade department was going to be set up, and actually the way in which Britain would then begin, I suppose in some ways, almost relearning this ability to negotiate and carry out trade agreements on its own behalf. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Liam Fox.
When we set up the Department for International Trade, I actually wanted it to be the Department for International Trade and Investment, echoing Ricardo's view there that they are two sides of the same coin, and we don't actually think about them in an integrated way. Whether it was just that no one wanted a department called DITI, I don't know. But we do still suffer from the lack of integration of policy around investment as being a central part of what we think. Over the last few years, Britain's been about the third top destination globally for foreign direct investment. Why is the question? Investors don't come to Britain because they like the weather, that's for sure. So there have to be concrete reasons, and in the extensive work that's been done, asking investors why Britain, why not Germany, why not France, for example, the answers are incredibly standard when you come to look at them. First of all, they'll say, main reason for investing in the UK is the rule of law. We understand your legal system, it's predictable, it's fair and equitable. And the reputation for British law is unsurpassed anywhere. Secondly, they'll say, you've got a flexible labour market and flexible skills. They're absolutely key. As one of my friends once said to me, if I want to employ someone at £18,000, it'll cost me £20,000 in the UK. And if they're not up to the job, I can let them go. If I want to do it in Germany, it'll cost me £22,000. And if I want to let them go, I've got to give them a year's salary. And if I want to do it in France, it'll be £24,000, and I can never let them go. He said the flexibility of the UK labour market is a very key element in that. Then we've got our regulatory framework, the stability of the regulatory framework. And when we have meddled with that during an investment cycle, for example, in the things like water, for example, you can't expect your investors to come back in the next cycle. If you've been kowtowing to the tabloid press who say these people are making profits that are too great, when they're in fact exactly within the contract that they signed with the government. If you want them to continue to invest, don't mess with them during an investment cycle. Then they'll say the permissiveness of the tax system. Lesson, don't raise your taxes, especially your corporate taxes. Then they will say the access to collaboration with higher education. We've got 4 of the top 10 universities in the world. No other EU country has got 1 in the top 10, and never mind 4. And that's also a big reason for pulling in investment. We speak English, bit of an accent of history, that one. And they'll say you've got great access to tech, which we have, and then great IP protection. I remember having dinner with President Xi in Beijing, and he was complaining that a lot of too many Chinese companies were choosing to start up in London rather than starting up in Shanghai or Beijing. And he said, I hear that you've got very good IP protection. I remember turning to Theresa May and saying, what's Chinese for irony? When it comes to IP protection. So we know all the reasons why people will choose to come to the UK as a whole. The question is, are all our regions equally attractive in each of those 8 areas of investment? For example, is our predominance of the universities in the south of the country drawing disproportionate amounts of money down there rather than in other parts, and how do we change that? We've also in the UK got a too poor a record on exporting. DIT estimated that with about, or at least there are tens of thousands of companies who should be exporting, but they're not. And then we know this because their peers, companies exactly like them of the same size and type of sector, are already exporting. We export only about 28% of our GDP. Germany exports about 49% of its GDP. A huge difference in the money generated for the exchequer as a consequence. We know that exporting companies are more resilient. They will survive longer. They will be more profitable, and they'll create better paid jobs than their counterparts who don't export. So we need to be generating a culture. One of the questions that I chair the Global Britain Commission, and one of the questions we're looking at is why is this culture like that? And one of the things we're looking at is the relationship between companies willing to export and the means by which they're funded. For example, companies that are funded by equity rather than bank debt are much more likely to be exporters. Why? And what are we going to do about it in terms of how we go about our ability to scale up some of our small businesses? And then at the big picture, which we can come on to, we have an obsession with free trade agreements. Free trade agreements that are largely going to be doing finished manufactured goods and agriculture are not going to generate much for the UK economy. What we need is global liberalisation of services, to remember that services are the biggest part of our economy, and trade agreements that don't include liberalisation of services will be suboptimal at best for the UK. There's actually a hierarchy when it comes to trade agreements. At the top, you've got big liberalising multilateral agreements. Below that, you've got agreements of the willing, the plurilateral agreements. Then you've got regional trade agreements, and right at the bottom you've got bilateral free trade agreements. I'm afraid that in our independent trade policy we've been focusing too much at the bottom of that food chain and not enough at the higher elements, and we need to put a lot more effort into getting global liberalisation if we're going to achieve what we want. And just one thing, final thought on levelling up. I sat through a meeting of trade ministers in Switzerland. It took 55 minutes before anyone said the C word. I mean, please remember consumers. Trade is not all about producers. And in terms of levelling up, I want to see the ability of people to stretch their incomes further by seeing prices lower. And that's one of the benefits of trade. So the Conservative Party, of all parties, mustn't become captured by producer interests. There are a lot more consumers out there than there are producers. And we've got to be pointing out the benefits of trade, not just at home. Let's remember that there is still a sense of altruism in this country. Trade is the way we've taken 2 billion people out of poverty in the last decade worldwide. And we've got to continue to liberalise that trade. And the most worrying statistic as we move out of the pandemic is this, that back in the third quarter of 2009, at the end of the acute part of the financial crisis, only 0.7%, 0.7% of all the imports of G20 countries were covered by restrictive measures, either tariffs or non-tariff barriers. By the first quarter of 2020, that had risen to an incredible 10.3% of all imports. In other words, in that decade, we've been adding more and more protectionism into our own economies, which is actually having an adverse effect on global trade. And in the quarter before the pandemic hit, global trade actually contracted. We'd been watching its level of growth falling, but it actually went negative. In other words, we saw a contraction in both the volume and value of global trade. That was largely our fault in the world's richest economies, by putting a bit of consumer protection here, a bit of environmental legislation there, a bit of producer protection here. They all add up incrementally. And we're seeing a problem in global trade that we will have to put right. And as we come out of the the pandemic and we start to think about these problems, I'm afraid that's going to be number one. And the WTO, which I almost accidentally became the Director General of, is, I'm afraid, a bit of a basket case at the moment and unable because it doesn't have the mechanisms to deal with these big issues. So it's an urgent crisis, not that you would know by reading our newspapers or watching our media, but it's a problem that we will have to deal with very quickly.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that, Liam. And our third and final speaker is here, I suppose, wearing two hats, actually, only metaphorically so far. She's a distinguished business leader and entrepreneur in her own right, but she also chairs the Lancashire Enterprise Partnership and therefore has that position within regional policy, within county business leadership, to deal day-to-day with people in all sorts of different sectors, and to really be at the actual front line of a lot of the topics that, as I said at the start, people in Westminster sometimes talk about theoretically. She has that practical insight and perspective. So please join me in welcoming Debbie Francis Obe.
It would probably be better if I just never said anything now. Yeah, so I think, listening to what Professor Fox was saying, Dr. Fox was saying, is that it's really important. Foreign direct investment for me and for the businesses that I work with across Lancashire. There's a firm belief in place that actually, if we have all of the conditions right, then we will be able to attract the investment. Whilst there's always work to be done through policies to make sure that investment can come into the country and into the regions. You've already heard that we are very successful within the UK at attracting FDI and expanding business that way. My businesses in Lancashire kind of all believe that the investment will come if the conditions are right for the investment to come. So the policy is one side of it, which we're saying we've probably got right to an extent and needs to keep being looked at. But we need here in the north the conditions to be right. And I am looking at this very much from that north-south perspective. There is no issue with foreign direct investment and the amount that we're getting within the southeast. It comes in, and we're back to the same statement. The reason there is a white paper, a levelling up white paper, because the hath, basically. So it will keep coming where it looks like the conditions are right. Here in the north, our leaders are telling us the same thing over and over again. Businesses will expand. We have businesses waiting to expand and to put their money into this region. But to do that, they've got to be able to connect, whether that's digitally or physically, and they've got to be able to access the skills. And accessing the skills comes down to connecting the skills, being able to access the businesses and where they are. We have two of huge businesses here in Lancashire through BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce. And both of them are constrained by some of the physical connectivity issues that we have. BAE will tell you that they are told they're not as competitive as they need to be. And this comes down to some of the import and export costs associated with their goods, which is down to the logistics of connectivity, not much else. The same goes for Rolls-Royce, who still take the jet engines out of through a tiny village on the back of a truck because they're going hundreds of miles with it because they've got no other way to get out. That type of condition is not attractive. That type of condition doesn't encourage people to expand. Now, there are two bigger businesses. We have some amazing engineering operations in Lancashire, and it is a real engineering hub in lots of ways. And again, our engineering companies do export. They do export quite a lot, and they export a lot of innovative thinking as well as an actual product. But they are constrained by the fact that the connectivity isn't in place. So I think that, everybody here at this conference is a firm believer, of course, that, economic growth is run by businesses. And if you let businesses get on with what they do, when you make the conditions right through trade and through taxes and through all of those conditions, those businesses will continue to grow. And we firmly believe that, and my businesses tell me that. But you've got to be able to attract them into a certain area, and to do that, you've got to say we need the skills to be able to access jobs, and we need the companies to be able to connect to other companies, both nationally and globally. And that's one of the problems that we face here in Lancashire in respect to the connectivity, which was talked about in the first place. So for me, levelling up has always been about creating the conditions for a community or a region to level itself up. Okay, handouts are not what is needed. There needs to be a fundamental turning of the dial on something that says that creates the conditions to level up. Many people that know me know that I'm a transport fanatic in all sorts of ways, and that my personal belief is that resolving some of the physical connectivity issues in particular will be the answer to giving the North the chance to level itself up with everything else. That may, you know, there may be people argue it's not that, it's something else. I'm happy to have that debate. But I believe that the jam spreading approach of tackling or trying to tackle everything may not be the right answer. And what we won't get as a consequence is a real turning of the dial that allows that long-term sustainable future and level up.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting, thank you. Like most journalists covering politics, I've asked about 4,500 people in Westminster, what does levelling up mean? And I've received about 4,200 definitions in response. But the most coherent that I've heard as yet, certainly the most brief and coherent, is Michael Gove's answer, which is that levelling up is about the fact that ability and potential is equally spread across the UK, but opportunity is not. And that clearly applies in terms of infrastructure and business, just as it does to individuals and individual businesses and individuals in terms of their own skills and kind of potential in their own lives. Now, we have, I think, just under half an hour for questions. I know there'll be various people keen to ask things from the audience. A couple of ground rules that we apply at all Conservative Home events. Please, when I pick you, wait for the microphone to arrive. Please let us know who you are and where you're from. And finally, please, I can't stress this enough, make it actually a question rather than a speech. Otherwise, I'll be compelled to boo you from the chair, which I have actually done at least once. So you have been warned. Who would like to put the first question to the panel? The gentleman here.
Hello, Jack Richardson, a member in Rutland and Melton. Dr. Fox, you mentioned about how when the International Trade Department was formed, you wanted it to be called International Trade and Investments. Just building on that, I'm interested to know, there have been calls for the Foreign Office, for the International Trade Department to be rolled into the Foreign Office for a more cohesive link between the two. I'm just interested to get your views on that.
No, I wouldn't do that. I would take energy out of BEIS and I'd roll what's left of BEIS inside the Department of Trade to give us a business and trade department that actually joined up our thinking on these things. And I would work out where in government outward direct investment sits, because while foreign direct investment sits currently with DIT, outward direct investment doesn't sit anywhere at all in the government. There are no ministers responsible for outward direct investment. And I think a smart country would be looking to see how they could use the tools that they've got, including the development budget, to be able to help shape markets overseas to be not only to be better destinations for UK exports, but where we might be able to use the unique skills we've got in services to help build those markets up. What I'd like to see is, as I've said to many of my colleagues, I'd like to see us put our aid budget out of business by creating an environment where we gave developing countries the skills they need to trade their way out of poverty. And that, I think, would be a great aim for us. So, you know, I wouldn't make that change. And not being the world's greatest fan of the Foreign Office, having worked there as a minister, I wouldn't be giving the Foreign Office any more responsibilities.
Professor.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point in terms of what is the architecture that we design in terms of dealing with investors, and in particular when it comes to smaller investors that are the ones that have a lot of potential, in particular for the regions in decline or the North. Then having a clear architecture that can be read from the outside is very important. At the moment, this architecture is not as transparent as it should be to foreign investors. So really thinking about, explicitly thinking about investors and foreign direct investment in a cohesive architecture or investment promotion, attraction. And the other important point is retention. So how and to what extent you create the conditions for existing investors to profit from their activities, in the UK is also very important. And this architecture at the moment is not as streamlined as it should be, but this is key for the success of a leveling up agenda that tries to leverage private capital, private investments, and foreign investment.
Thank you. Liam, could I quickly ask, I'm going to use the tyrannical power of the chair to ask a follow-up question on my own behalf. Can you give us a brief insight into what it was like actually creating a department from scratch? I mean, you essentially get a brief from the Prime Minister of, like, this is what's going to be this is what I'd like it to be, and then presumably you go back to her and say, well, it needs to include X, Y, and Z. But how do you actually carve that out in Whitehall 40 years after a civil servant last did this job?
Yeah, it was, it was a bit of a surprise being asked to do it, first of all. Can you create a department for international trade? Here are your civil servants for. So I was 20% of the department on day one. So there were some, clearly we had to get Brexit ready as an economy. We had to therefore replicate all the agreements that the European Union had with third countries. That was a huge task because we didn't have any trade negotiators. So we had to train people, borrow people in order to get that function done. Then we had to do other legal requirements. We had to be able to do trade remedies because that would be an international legal requirement. So some things came from our responsibilities under the WTO and some things were other elements that we had to look at. We discovered that we had phenomenal conflicts of interest because suddenly you are both the person who licenses our exports and the person who promotes our exports. And if that didn't produce a conflict of interest, I don't know what did. So I said on day one, how does that work? Can we have a lawyer, please? And so we gradually built up. And I would say in that department, it's a really interesting exercise because I would have thought that that department was at its most efficient after about 2 years. We were fulfilling all the functions we had. We didn't have compliance officers and diversity officers and all the civil servants that we gained over time, which didn't actually contribute to the trade element of the department. And so the bureaucracy grew, I would have said, in its third year at a level that was far faster than it was serving our actual departmental needs. And I think there's a lesson in all of that. And also, in the first part of that department's life, there were no DGs, no Director Generals in that department that I didn't appoint myself. So I knew who everyone was. They all knew exactly what their role was. And having taken over the MOD in 2010, when it was totally a basket case financially, we inherited what we thought was a 39 billion deficit, turned out to be 55 billion over the decade, and that was at a time when we were applying 7% budget cuts. But we got it round by knowing the structure that we needed to get to, and I therefore built the whole of the Department of International Trade around the board. And the board met once a month for 3 hours. And at that, ministers took policy decisions the day before. The implementation decisions were taken by the board at the departmental meeting. Everybody knew what everyone else was doing. Everyone else knew what everyone else would do in the next month, and we would come back and look at their targets and see whether they'd been met in that time. And it was a tight structure, which I think did work. But as very often in Whitehall, what Michael Gove would call the blob has an ability to weave its way into the functions of a department that are actually generating money.
Thank you very much. The lady here.
Thank you. Jennifer Powers, Deputy Chair, Richmond Park. Dr. Fox, I thought it was really interesting framework about for investment. And you mentioned tech access, and you also mentioned regulatory framework as two of those 8. And I wondered what role DTI has in influencing the legislative agenda of the rest of government, bearing that in mind, because we have something like the Online Safety Bill, which was published last week, which is an incredibly complex, onerous, bureaucratic, anti-investment, and I would add censor's charter, but that's not the point of my question. And this will have, the tech community is saying this is going to have huge ramifications on the attractiveness of Britain. For startups and for scale-ups, and that, you know, the biggest players will find their way around this through lawyers, but the rest of Britain's reputation on tech will be irrevocably damaged. So what role does DTI play in trying to influence that legislative agenda that may come back to haunt investment and exports? Thank you.
Well, I think it's not joined up enough. I don't think that Whitehall has changed sufficiently post-Brexit. We've still got the same structures of Whitehall that we had pre-Brexit, and despite the fact we've got a whole range of new roles to play internationally. It's where I think Dominic Cummings was right. Not very many things I agree with Dominic Cummings on, but he was right that the shape of government's wrong, and that does need to change, and it's not integrated enough. We were actually able to go back to what Debbie was saying. We actually had an ability at our best, and I think that the most efficient bit of that department, to look at areas where we did need investment and try to match it with what is, let's face it, a world with a lot of cash floating around in sovereign wealth funds. And the Qataris wanted to invest in the UK, and we actually gave them a playbook. In other words, we said, here's a project. This is what you can get for $500,000, $1 million, 5 million, 10 million, 50, $500 million, all the way up. I think when we finished, by the time we were finished that project, I think we'd attracted something like 5 billion of Qatari money to Birmingham, because we looked at specific projects that needed money. We could identify the areas, and it was a very practical way in which the government could help direct people who were looking to invest and match it up with investment opportunities. We need to do a lot more of that, and we need to do that in the north of England, but we've got some glaring omissions. So you've got the fact that the Port of Liverpool can handle any traffic that goes through the Panama Canal. No matter how big it is, it can be handled by Liverpool. We could be transporting goods onto our East Coast ports and serving the Baltics and the Nordics. But have we got a railway that runs from the west to the east? No, because everything in Britain's got to begin and end in London. We need to have transport infrastructure that is independent of that thinking, and particularly linking, I think, the east and the west of England. That is missing. And the other thing, you mentioned information. You cannot, in a modern economy, have transport for goods and services, but not for information. And the movement of data is just as important in a modern economy, especially a service economy like the UK. And I think that point was very well made, if I may say. I live in my constituency in North Somerset. We have no broadband has reached us yet, and it's not the middle of nowhere. And there are too many bits of Britain not properly served by information infrastructure. It's one of our biggest, after all the years and the money we put into it, it's one of our biggest failings.
Covering Debbie and then Ricardo.
Yeah, and I think two thoughts coming out of that discussion for me. So one is about, this better integration of government. If you look at the levelling up agenda and you look at everything that needs to be achieved in an area to level up, the reality is you need far more connectivity and understanding between departments than it happens at the moment. And there are cases. We have a good one, a simple case here in Lancashire actually, with the Eden Project North. No one department owns any accountability for that. So actually, and it's got potentially a big impact here from a levelling up perspective in Lancashire, but we can't quite get where we need to go with it because we can't get departments together because nobody's got the ownership of it. So we're looking at different things to do. But I think that because levelling up requires a look at every element of our lives, and that point was made at the beginning, how can each piece make the most of the money that it is going to spend if each piece is looking at its piece in isolation? I mean, you're never going to quite get that right. In respect of your specific question, I don't understand what legislation is in point. I'm not aware of it, but I have a lot more confidence that one way or another, small companies as well as big companies will find their way through and around these types of legislation that look very disruptive when they first come into place. They can often look ill thought out, and you think this is going to be a disaster. I've found our experiences, because at the end of the day, the UK is a platform for people to want to do business, is a place that people want to come to live, to invest and to work, one way or another, small or large. The large ones will find their way around it first because they can afford the lawyers, as you've said. but the small ones will find a way through. I've got every confidence in it. Doesn't mean, you know, it would be better if we didn't just roll out that type of legislation without a little bit more thought around it. But generally, the companies that I see work their way around this stuff all the time.
Professor.
I just wanted to highlight the importance of these connections across different policy areas. You cannot really think about physical infrastructure, like roads, for example, without broadband and without ICT connectivity, because this has to do more and more with how you maintain, for example, the roads, or think about self-driving vehicles. So the future of mobility and the future of infrastructure is driven by this interconnection between different policy areas. So even or dealing with climate change, dealing with extreme weather events, you need to think about roads and railways that need sensors that in real time give you information on the viability and how the network is working, and this needs to be done in a very fine-grained manner in different areas, because infrastructure work as a network. So the problem is not only London, but that's how the rest of the network work, and you need real-time information. So ICT and physical infrastructure are closely connected, and investors are definitely aware of the importance, the resilience of the system. So it's not only having the infrastructure in place, but having a resilient system. If that we have a flood or if we had extreme heat waves, the system needs to be resilient, need to work, and need to be able to deal with events like the pandemic that the World Health Organization has said might be a recurrent feature of the future of our societies. So how do we build systems that are not only able to connect, but also able to be resilient and resistant to shocks? And this is what forms an ecosystem in general. So the connectivity of these different areas is not only, it's creating the connection, creating the conditions for investment to flow, but it's also creating the conditions for investors to know about those conditions and for those conditions to work as a system. So for all the ingredients and the components to be balanced and coordinated in an effective manner. That's what we call the investment ecosystem. And when looking at cases throughout Europe, what we have found is that when these systems are addressed properly through dedicated local institutions, then in less advanced regions in Europe, they have been able to generate 71% more investments vis-à-vis regions that do not have this type of ecosystem and institutions that create the connections within the ecosystem. So this is a crucial policy priority as part of a credible levelling up strategy.
Thank you. I'm going to take two questions. So the gentleman standing there, and then the lady, if you raise in front of him.
Thank you.
We've got you.
Thank you. My name is Christos Kotis. I am a member for Edinburgh, but I also work for DIT. I'd like to give you the inside knowledge of what's happening at the moment with trying to level up UK regions through global trade.
As long as it's a question.
It's definitely a question.
Marvellous.
So I joined last year. It's one of these new Northern Powerhouse roles as an export manager. I represent Greater Manchester. I'm pretty sure Debbie works with my colleague Lynn here in Lancashire, trying to increase trade in our region. Doing a lot of good work, all these good points made today. However, we have an obstacle, we have a problem, and that's my question. The data we have to work with is very, very poor. So we set up really good strategies, really good plans, but we cannot measure success. So we have no KPIs, and we just don't know what does good look like. So we say, well, we just brought out a Greater Manchester export plan. We have 11,000 exporters, £15 billion worth of trade, goods and services. And when people ask us, Lancashire is exactly the same. Where would you like to be in 3 years' time? We just don't know. Services data is rubbish. It's actually underestimated. I think we're missing out on a lot of export services data. And this isn't criticism to DIT, it's actually ONS and HMRC figures. But what can we do? And it was on the new UK government export strategy came out in November that these will be addressed. But what Dr. Fox thinks can happen in order to improve on that? Thank you.
Thank you. And our second questioner.
Hi there, Lindsay Jones from the Conservative Environment Network. You mentioned Teesside at the very beginning. A lot of the investment there has come from low-carbon solutions and renewable energy. I wondered, particularly Debbie, if you could talk about what role net zero can play in supporting levelling up in other regions.
Thank you both. Can we start with Debbie, then Ricardo, and then we'll end with you?
Yeah, so I think obviously here in Lancashire, we're quite proud, I think, to have the highest level of effectively carbon neutral input and productivity of anywhere in the whole country. So I think for all businesses, and I think for all regions, the net zero agenda in the round can create a lot of opportunities for much...
Sorry, John.
For much smarter working, for much cleverer approaches to things, and for new skills and talents as well. So I think it will open up the opportunity to look at things differently and to have new skills and talent. Even actually things that people don't even think about as new skills. So, for example, whether you're a heating engineer or a plumber or whatever, you look at what's an electrician, you look at what's going to be required of those skills in the future, and it changes when you look at what might be required because of net zero. So even at the most fundamental level, I think it opens up huge opportunities for everybody. There are lots of companies I speak to that are worried about it. They worry, and I understand the worry. The worry is that there's often a cost, or there appears to be a cost to trying to implement some of what we're going to need to do. But I think also at the end of the day, if you can look a little bit further than that, there should also be for that cost a benefit being gained. But it is something we have to work really closely with our businesses for, and I think government need to play their part in that, in terms of helping share the best practice, in terms of helping making everybody understand what they're going to need to do and potentially what that journey will need to look like. But I think it opens up a lot of opportunities, and here in Lancashire it certainly does, in terms of some of the industries that we've already got. They're already really focused on the carbon neutral agenda and in productivity around that. So I think for Lancashire, I would hope it offers up even more opportunity than most, but I've got to say that I'm chair with a LEP.
Ricardo.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to the question on data, because I think that's another very important issue. Not only we know very little about the investments that are coming in, but we know even less in terms of their geographical destination. So the extent to which we have information on trade and investment, the fine-grained geographical scale, is simply non-existent. So we don't have the ONS is not collecting data systematically. And we had a survey on UK companies investing abroad, and that gave us good information, reasonably good information on the sourcing structure and the strategies of those firms, and the survey has been discontinued. So we are really going in an area and making key decisions, in particular with reference to leveling up, so where we want to know where investment decisions are being taken, where investments are going, where is it that investment are coming into the UK. We have no information, and this is critical. And this needs to be solved in order to be able to have to design evidence-based policies. There are new ways to collect data, so we can bypass what the ONS is not delivering by using big data analytics and try to derive information or use private sources to build information. And that's something the LSE is doing extensively, for example, and also creating connections with universities in terms of intelligence to support strategic decisions at the local and at the national level would be definitely an important part of an evidence-based strategy. So the information is there, is again creating the right connections. A final point on net zero. I think it's very important to take net zero as a source of competitive advantage, because that's where the rest of the world is moving into, and in Europe is making with the recovery plans throughout European countries significant investments, public investments, with the idea of leverage these public investments to attract private capital. So that's part of the competitive environment that the UK needs to deal with, together with the importance of the net zero target in terms of the future of the country in terms of the consequence. So it's both about mitigation and dealing with the consequences of climate change. But more generally, this needs to be part of a value proposition to investors. Missing out on that would be a critical mistake in terms of the value proposition of the countries and its regions for foreign investors.
Dr. Fox.
Ricardo's dealt, I think, with that information point more eloquently than I could, but it's absolutely true. There are not enough KPIs in government. And ministers are asked to make decisions with inadequate amounts of information, not just data, but quite often a broader picture. I remember saying to my civil servants, I said, when I was still practicing medicine, if I made decisions on so little data, I'd be up in front of the General Medical Council. Sometimes the database was so poor, you'd be not much more than a good educated guess at times. A lot of the information is out there. It's just not all collected in the one place. And it's a lot of times it's our systems of bringing information together. It's also asking the right questions of business and finding out what are the rate limiting steps. I'll give you a practical example. The government of Mozambique came to see us and said, we've got the world's third biggest gas reserves. We can't exploit them properly. We don't have support industries, businesses to do that. You're quite quiet in the North Sea at the moment. Would a number of companies be willing to come and invest? They said, absolutely not. I went up to Aberdeen and they said, I said, what's the problem? They said, it's too risky an environment for investment. There's still a lot of militia activity. We worry about being paid and all these elements. And I said, why don't you take out political risk insurance? They said, it's too expensive. So we created, as you probably know in the department, through our own export guarantee scheme, political risk insurance. We went from 0 to 3.2 billion invested in Mozambique in 6 months by finding out what it was that business wanted, not what the department wanted to deliver for them, turning it on its head and actually saying, what is the help that you need from us to be able to be a better exporter, and it's possible to do so. And it's a terrible thing for a politician to say, but if politicians were a bit more on receive rather than transmit all the time, it might make life a bit easier for everyone.
Anything to add on net zero?
Well, no, I mean, I think that, yes, I think, again, Ricardo made the point that it is also potentially a competitive advantage, but we've got to be realistic about it. And simply plucking dates for net zero without knowing what the roadmap is to get there is not the most sensible thing to do. And you need to be able to, on the road to decarbonisation, know what trajectory you're on. You need to know what the downsides are, what we're going to do on energy security, how do we stop people becoming victims of energy poverty on our way. So you just need to think about it. And just because you know what your destination is doesn't mean you've got a roadmap necessarily to get there. And we need to carefully think that through if we're going to maximise what is definitely a huge potential competitive advantage for our economy, leaving aside any of the environmental arguments.
Now, Debbie, I think you'd like to come in on that, and then we'll try and fit in one or two quickfire questions.
Yeah, it's just very quickly. Whereas I totally agree, you need a roadmap to get there. You can't hit what you're not aiming at. So, and that is the reason we're now facing a more critical place from a climate change than we were, because everybody's been aware for decades that this was possibly a problem, but there was nothing in place, so we've just let it ride, and we just let it ride, and we just let it ride. It's like, because we never did set it up. So while I agree, setting the date isn't going to mean you're going to achieve it. You can't hit what you're not aiming at. So setting the date has got to be a start point to at least make people finally say, yes, we've got to take some positive action here.
Thank you. So we literally have 2 minutes left in our time, so I'm going to ask social contract to this bit. Very short questions, ideally with very short answers, and we'll try and fit people in. John, if it's a very short question.
Being blunt, Chairman.
The microphone is just...
Levelling up is pure, meaningless jargon, which the man in the street has not the slightest idea what it's all about. It's pure froth. And unless politicians start...
Is there a question mark
it's coming
towards me?
Unless politicians start talking in terms where the man in the street can understand, if the region wants more money to do a bypass, then say you want more taxpayers' money and zero cost.
John, I did say right? Short questions and a question mark, neither of which have materialised. So I must say.
Well, I'd like the panel's views on whether it is jargon.
Question mark. Excellent. Anybody else for a final question in the time available to us? The gentleman.
Yeah, Adam Yasuddin from Finchley and Golders Green, the very famous Prime Minister comes from. She once said that we're the nation of shopkeepers, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong. So what do you suggest those small businesses, I know you mentioned Amazon, but also the other supermarkets comes in and destroy the small corner shops? What advice would you give them? Because they have no way of competing with those big mega supermarkets apart from suffering in silence.
Thank you very much. Ricardo.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, that's an important point. That's building what is unique to those places so that the local shops can upgrade in a sense, so that they don't compete with the supermarket, that is also needed because can deliver lower prices, but can compete on quality, so have a process of upgrading in such a way that they can deliver things that people need in a better way, so can create value, can leverage more also local suppliers, for example, so can create more opportunity for small producers. So that's what I mentioned at the beginning about creating value chains. Part of these value chains are really local and have to do with upgrading of local businesses. So that's create a sense of what are the strengths of those places. And I think if we do that, then also leveling up becomes something that has a concrete meaning for people on the ground.
Debbie.
Yeah, I feel the same way in terms of the small business. I totally understand the problem of the corner shop issue. But I think, I would hope COVID might have seen us decide that we have to have a slight inclination now towards more localization. I think there is an awareness across a lot of areas that maybe we need to develop very much locally as well as these big nationals. But I completely agree with my colleague at the end of the table there, in that it's about finding the thing you can differentiate on. So it's no good trying to sell the tin of baked beans because you're not going to compete. There is that element of convenience that you can attract, but the other element is about finding something that is a higher quality offering, and whether that's about the service, the local impact, the local engagement, whatever it is, and that is probably the only way to do it versus the big nationals.
And final word to Liam.
For me, levelling up is equality of opportunity, which is what differentiates Conservatives from Socialists. We believe in equality of opportunity, they believe in equality of outcome. And that's the essential difference. As with most things, boils down to first principles. And, when it comes to, what sort of shops should we have, what sort of services should we have, you cannot make the consumer fit the supply. The supply has to fit the consumer. And ultimately, if you have a business that sells what people want at a price that people are willing to pay, that business will be successful. If you're not, it won't.
Thank you very much. And on that stark truth, I think we bring the discussion to a close. I'd like to say a few thank yous. Firstly, to the London School of Economics and Political Science for partnering with us on this event. Secondly, to all of our panellists, Ricardo, Debbie and Liam, for their insights. Thank you to all of you here in the room in Blackpool and watching us online at home for joining us. And also, thank you to my great Conservative Home team for making this whole fringe here in Blackpool possible. I hope you'll join me in a round of applause for all those who've brought this together.
Absolutely.